What would you do if you came into some money? What would you do if you came into some money today? Maybe you win a lottery. Maybe business is going better than expected. Maybe you sold a house and now you have some capital sitting in your account. How would you use new money? I can think of a dozen things I'd like to do if some money came my way. Those of you who have seen my house would know that my house needs painting. The driveway needs redoing, and I'd like to set up some savings for my kids. There's a lot of things, good things, and even gratifying things that I would like to spend some money on. But the real question is this. Would any of these investments be worthwhile if I remain spiritually bankrupt toward God? Would any of my investments matter if I am bankrupt toward God? A question like this is a soul question. It's not so much just a simple yes or a no, it is a soul question. It searches within. It is a question which unearths what is truly going on in my heart, bringing to the surface what my truest commitments and priorities really are. Not just what I say that they are, but what they really are. And to be honest, what we discover in this inner world of our souls is not always beautiful, true, or good. We find in ourselves selfish ambitions rather than free-flowing and generous love toward God and His kingdom. And the more we examine our inner world, the more obvious it becomes to us that our souls are diseased and in need of a cure. The same is true for the man in verse 13. He came to Jesus clearly upset that the family inheritance did not trickle down into his bank account. He's upset that there's a family inheritance and he is seeing none of it. As he said, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." You know, on the surface, it sounds like this man was fighting for fairness. This is a righteous cause that he has got on his hands. And surely he thinks, Jesus, of all the people who knows right from wrong, surely Jesus would take his side and fight this injustice of being cheated out of an inheritance. But Jesus detects something far deeper going on, a hidden motive, the impulse of a diseased soul. Jesus detected a soul diseased with greed, lusting for cash. More about that in a minute, but for now I do want us to note that this impulse toward greed is something that both the rich and the poor struggle with. Greed is something that both the poor and the rich struggle with, both the haves and the have-nots. And we need to know this if we're going to be honest about the greed that actually resides in our own hearts. You know, often we blame the very wealthy for being greedy. We say, tax the greedy rich, don't we? Newspapers write about the insatiable greed of the richest 1% in the world. Even the Pope has come out to say that often the wealthiest members of society operate out of pure greed. We seem to apportion greed more instinctively to those in the financial tiers above us. Yet in this text we see that even those that are without wealth share the impulse of greed. Tell my brother to give me my money. Even those that are without can be tempted by greed. That is the hidden motive, the diseased soul that Jesus recognized, even though it was dressed up in talk of fairness and justice. And this brings us to two important lessons that we're going to learn in the text. There are two very important lessons for us here. The lesson of the rich fool, which is aimed at those who hoard excessive wealth, and the lesson of anxiety, which is aimed at those who do not possess much wealth at all. Both hoarding and anxiety are symptoms of a diseased soul that needs a cure. Both hoarding and anxiety are symptoms of a diseased soul that needs a cure. Both need to hear one's life does not consist in the abundance of its possessions. Both need to hear where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Both need to hear the freeing invitation to seek God's kingdom and the generous pleasure of God to give you that kingdom. Jesus made his point in the parable of the rich fool, and let's pick that up in verse 16. Jesus told them a parable saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentiful, and he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have nowhere to store my crops.'" You know, Jesus is picturing an honest farmer. He's not cheating his way into wealth. He's not ripping anyone off. He is an honest worker. He has worked for his money, and he has happened to have a sensational season. And now he faces a dilemma of what to do with all his extra wealth. The season has gone well. He's got more than what he would usually get. Now what is he going to do? And his answer to that dilemma is to build bigger barns, hoard his excessive wealth, and get comfortable. That's how he's going to solve this problem. I have more than I need, so I'm going to keep more than I need. And verse 19 oozes with his determination to be comfortable. "I will say to my soul, 'Soul, you have ample goods. Relax, eat, drink, be merry.'" So let's think about this. Unbeknown to him, that night would actually be his last. He's made his plans, he's drawn up his building plans, and he's going to build big. But unbeknown to him, that is the night that the Lord requires his soul. At his death, God would ask him, "The things that you have prepared, whose will they be?" And then Jesus makes the point. The soul set on hoarding that amount of wealth while remaining bankrupt toward God is a foolish and diseased soul that desperately needs a cure. To hoard that amount of excessive wealth is a diseased soul. It needs a cure. Now, why would Jesus bother exposing the soul disease of greed? Why? Why does he bother? Scholar David Garland made the observation, usually those who possess riches are possessed by them. Usually those who possess riches are actually possessed by them. What he was getting at is this, that if we have money, money can either be used in service to God or it becomes our God. You can either use your money in service to God or your money will become your God. Those are the only options we have. And this is why the famed Christian and author and speaker Timothy Keller called money a counterfeit God. Because money substitutes itself as our Savior, our rescuer, our cure for our diseased soul. Money, like God, says to us, "Serve me, Devote yourself to me. Lose yourself in me, and I will make you well. That's what your money is saying to you, whispering to you. And we all do this to some degree. We all want to yield to that temptation. We all have a built-in default, a factory setting that makes us want to serve counterfeit gods. And we want counterfeit gods to be our savior. This is our default setting as human beings. In Romans 1, the Apostle Paul diagnoses disease of the soul, our proclivity to give ourselves to counterfeit gods. And he says, look, the problem underneath the problem of humanity, for everything, for all the sins that we point out, the thing that drives it all is this. He says, our problem is that we exchange the truth about God for a lie, and we worship and serve the creature rather than the Creator. That's the soul disease that we are all afflicted with, that we would rather serve the creature, the money, rather than the Creator, the God who gives us good things to enjoy. We are all like Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark, trying to swap a bag of sand for gold, thinking that we're going to get away with it. We believe we can, and we believe we should. In the case of the rich fool, his counterfeit god was his newly acquired wealth. And to know what a counterfeit god might be, Timothy Keller helpfully suggested that counterfeit gods is anything more fundamental than God to your happiness and meaning in life and identity. Just think about that. A counterfeit god can be anything that is more meaningful to you than God Himself, more fundamental than God, than your happiness, for your happiness and your meaning in life and identity. It can even include things like your career, your family, your children, your spouse, your achievements, some political cause, your physical attractiveness, romance, human approval, power, comfort, and financial security. And the rich fool clearly saw his happiness, his meaning and identity in his financial security, but not in God. God is nowhere on his radar at all. He is entirely invested in making money his God. Look, I'm not a big fan of women in combat sports. But a few years ago, Ronda Rousey was at the height of her fighting career. She was the best of the best. She was the UFC champion in the women's division. She was just an unstoppable tornado. 12 wins, no losses, unbeatable. And then came her first defeat, and it rattled her world. In a candid interview, she shared the crushing loss of her identity when she realized she wasn't the undefeated champion anymore. She remembers saying to herself, what am I anymore if I'm not this? Now, if I'm not the champion, what am I? She remembers sitting in the medical corner, and she was thinking about killing herself because she felt this complete loss of identity. She was no longer the champ. And that was her identity. That was her counterfeit God. And when she lost it, everything broke apart. Now, whether she hoped being the best in the world would be the cure for her diseased soul, I may never know. But her reaction and her confession in that interview does make me think that she was leaning pretty heavily on her reputation as a fighter for her happiness, her meaning in life, and her identity. And when that reputation, when that counterfeit God let her down, her life fell apart. Counterfeit gods will always do this. They will always do this. They promise to fix and fulfill us. They promise us that they will make us happy and make us feel significant. But they cannot deliver on that promise. They are fragile. They can be taken away from us. And that means only God is capable of delivering on that promise, of fixing you, of fulfilling you, of giving you your significance and identity. Only God can do that. And the counterfeit gods will promise you that, but they cannot deliver. So if money or excess wealth has become the counterfeit god for the rich fool, a natural question might arise. We might be wondering something like this: is having money always bad? Like, am I allowed to have $10 in my savings account? I don't need it today, but might need it tomorrow. Is it wrong? Is being a rich Christian something we should frown upon? Hardly so. But clearly wealth has its trappings. It's not a sin to be a wealthy Christian, but wealth has its trappings. Which is why Jesus warned us, take care and be on your guard against all covetousness. For one's life does not consist in the abundance of his possessions. The trappings of excessive wealth is that we start to believe that life does consist in the abundance of our possessions. That is its trap. That is what it makes you believe. So how should wealthy Christians think about their wealth? These are just extrapolations of the text. You know, if Jesus is picking on a wealthy guy, the question is really, well, how then should Christians think about wealth? Well, firstly, Jesus would have wealthy Christians live more freely with their wealth, not hoarding it like the rich fool. Jesus said it is more blessed to give than receive. And in this particular passage, he did charge them to give to the needy. And elsewhere it is said, as for the rich in this present age, charge them not to be haughty, nor to set their hopes on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly provides us with everything to enjoy. They are to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share, thus storing up treasure for themselves as a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is truly life. You know, of this, John Piper, with a great sense of conviction, said the following. He said, "Why does God bless us with an abundance? You know, if you are one of the super wealthy Christians, it's right to just take pause and take stock for a second and go, why did God bless me with that kind of abundance?" And John Piper's answer to that question was so that we can have enough to live on and then use the rest for all manner of good works that alleviate spiritual and physical misery, temporal and eternal suffering. He said, enough for us and abundance for others. And then he warns, the issue is not how much a person makes. The issue is not how much a person makes. The evil is in being deceived into thinking that a large salary must be accompanied by a lavish lifestyle. It is coming to believe that because I take a fat paycheck home, I must live large. You don't have to. You really don't. You can live on enough for yourself and in abundance for others. For the man who came to Jesus demanding help to get rich, it is this lesson that cuts right to the heart. It's like Jesus saw right through his soul. He saw him transparently. This is not about fairness of what happens to the inheritance. What Jesus sees is a diseased soul. He sees a greed that is presenting itself to him. And Jesus is like asking him, are you after the money with a view to splurging on God and the kingdom? Or are you after the money for greedy and selfish intentions? It's like Jesus is asking him, will your money end up serving God? Or will you end up serving your money as God? That's what Jesus wants this man to think about. Greed then is just one counterfeit God that needs to be exposed and brought to Jesus for forgiveness and healing. But probably a good number of us don't really struggle with excessive resources. That's not really our problem. The lack of resources feels more like our problem, doesn't it? We fret when the fridge has more than one empty shelf. We go down anxious paths when there's not much paycheck left over once the rent and the groceries and the bills have been paid. And Jesus also had anxiety as a disease of the soul and mind. Look at verses 22 to 23 with me. He said to his disciples, therefore I tell you, do not be anxious about your life, what you will eat, nor about your body, what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Jesus' concern here is for those disciples who are less well off. He's addressed what it might look like to be a super wealthy disciple, but then what about those who are less well off? And this is now where Jesus turns his attention. Those of us who worry about how much food we have, or worry about replacing our clothes that are beginning to wear out. And what trips us up when we're constantly worrying about getting the basics that we need is often this. Hear me on this. The thing that trips us up when we are constantly worrying about our food and our clothing is this. In a very subtle way, we say to ourselves, when I get this part of my life sorted out, once I get this part of my life sorted out, balancing my income and my expenses, making it through a week without having to lean on the credit card, and making sure I'm putting even just a little bit away for savings, then I'll be in a position to think seriously about God and seeking his kingdom. But until then, we say to ourselves, until we can get those basics figured out, until I feel capable and safe and secure in my resources, forget about God, forget about him. I just don't think I have the bandwidth to think about a serious commitment to God. That's the kind of like inner dialogue, isn't it? I need to have security with food. I need to have security with my clothing. And maybe then I'll have the kind of mental capacity to think about God. And look, Jesus is not unsympathetic toward those who have scarcity of resource. Jesus grew up poor. His parents were so poor they could barely afford to make an offering at the temple. He was very familiar with scarcity of resources. In fact, one commentator pictures it this way. He says that Jesus is speaking to an audience that is predominantly poor. It's not just a few poor here or there. It is that this audience is predominantly poor or humble in social status. Most of his audience were people who labored from day to day for one day's wage. That's according to New Testament scholar Darrell Bock. So Jesus is not insensitive to the realities of material poverty. He gets it. He knows what that is like. He knows it sucks. But he was pointing out that sin in all its soul-diseased forms is not only found among the wealthy, but also among the less well-off. See, it was selfish ambition that stopped the rich fool from making a serious commitment to God. Yet it can be excessive anxiety over the basics which stops others from making a serious commitment to God. What help then does Jesus offer to those who are spiritually paralyzed by anxiety over the basics of life? What help does Jesus give us? What hope? Perhaps unexpectedly, Jesus points to birds and flowers. These people who are bent out of shape over what am I going to eat tonight, and my clothes are kind of getting all thin and patchy. What am I going to wear? And Jesus goes, hey, just take a minute to think about the birds. And while you're at it, have a look at some flowers while you're on your way. Birds that God cares for and feeds, flowers which God uses to beautify bland grass paddocks. All these are signs of God's care and provision, aren't they? I mean, if you think about it, if you just stop for a minute and you think about the birds in your garden or the neighbor's garden, and you think about the flowers as you drive along the road, and you think, these are actually all signs of God's care and provision. Signs that God cares for even the small things that we easily ignore. The birds and the flowers. And in this, Jesus is saying God knows very well. God knows it so well that food and clothing are important. He knows it because He clothes even the things that we don't care about. But He also knows that they, like wealth, can become excessively dominant concerns. Concerns so large that they become the thing we live for to gain our sense of happiness and meaning and significance, even to the point where God is being squeezed out of the picture. Both forms of soul disease, the enslavement to riches and the enslavement to anxiety, draw their power from the same taproot. They want to disorder our priorities, our goals, our pursuits, our loves. This is what Augustine, interestingly, saw as the rationale for all sin. He called it the disordering of love. That is, look, if you want a definition of sin, it's the disordering of your loves. Where God is not as important to us as He really is. And the replacement of God with counterfeits is that we deprioritize God and reprioritize something else over Him. And it's so easy to do. It comes naturally. We don't even have to work hard at it. It's natural to us to do this. This soul disease of a disordered love is caked onto the arteries of our souls. You know, a student can disorder his or her love for video games at the expense of study. A spouse can disorder his or her love of their career at the expense of their family. Now, neither video games nor careers are intrinsically bad things. But when they do become dominant, when they begin to control us, when they become the thing we get out of bed for each morning, when they become the thing that we live for, the thing we simply can't live without, that's when they have become counterfeit gods. That's when they have become a disordered love. And the same is true for wealth, and the same is true for anxiety. Both are capable of hijacking our affections. And the cure for this soul disease is this: our loves need to be reordered. That is the cure. Our loves need to be reordered from top to bottom, with God at the center and everything else relocated to their proper orbit. This is the reordering that our hearts desperately need. A reordered love that takes the basic shape that Jesus talked about when he said, instead, seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Fear not, little flock, for it is your Father's good pleasure to give you the kingdom. You know, I think herein lies the key to being free from enslavement to both wealth and anxiety. Jesus said, it is your Father's pleasure to give you the kingdom, his kingdom, salvation, eternal life, eternal blessing. It is your Father's pleasure. He delights to do this. It's not a begrudging gift. It's not like oh man, I really wish I didn't have to. It is his pleasure to give you his kingdom. He wants you to have it. And that is the cure. You know, our hoarding of wealth is an attempt to bring some kind of salvation kingdom into our own lives, isn't it? We hoard so that we can save ourselves, we can fix our own souls. We want something tangible to sink our souls into and say at the core of our beings, relax, eat, drink, be happy. And interestingly, anxiety and a preoccupation over food and clothing tries to do the exact same thing to bring this kind of salvation kingdom into our lives. It just does so with far fewer resources. But in the gospel, Jesus says, it is your Father's good pleasure. It is his good pleasure to give you his kingdom. It's a way of saying, look, you can use all your resources to try and build and buy some kingdom for yourself here on earth. Or you can look to God in Jesus Christ, trusting him, giving yourself to him. And you get a kingdom that God himself is present in and pleased to welcome you into. But you can't have both. You just can't have both. You can't have your kingdom and God's kingdom simultaneously. You can only serve one master. This is Jesus' cure for the diseased soul of greed and anxiety. In taking his cure, we become freer with our money because money is no longer treated as our God. Instead, we believe that it is God's pleasure to give us his kingdom. And we can learn to let go of our paralyzing anxieties. That's often hard to do, I know. But we can learn. We can learn to let go of our paralyzing anxieties for the same reason. We are not going to miss out on experiencing God's pleasure to give us His kingdom. We're not going to miss out. If you believe upon Christ, you are not going to miss out. This kingdom is ours by faith in Jesus alone. We cannot buy it and we cannot worry ourselves into it. It is a gift. So come, trust, enjoy, and reorder your love toward the one who delights to welcome you home. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also. Let's pray.